Hello, welcome. So this is a kind of reading an analysis of Clausewitz' section in On War on military genius. So he has a section which he kind of tries to define what military genius is, and it's a pretty interesting section. It does show you that Clausewitz is very much a philosopher of sorts. Um, he is thinking in ways which are, probably unimaginable for like any sort of military theorists to think of today. Uh, I can't imagine. I can't imagine this section being shown to any like soldiers being trained in modern militaries anywhere. I don't know. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know. But I just can't imagine it. Because his analysis here is so far from this kind of technocratic, mechanistic view of sort of like technological efficiency or whatever that is predominant today. And like this is everyone really. I mean, I don't know anyone actually who thinks in sophisticated ways about things like about military matters like this. That might be because we're sort of technologically sort of surpassed this era of warfare. This is the Napoleonic era that he's has in mind when he's discussing all this. So this is somewhat still in the kind of more traditional form of warfare. Obviously, there's gunpowder involved and cannon fire and all that. It's not like medieval or ancient warfare he's talking about, but there's just like there's so perhaps this is kind of it's the question of is Clausewitzian analysis relevant to today, like to warfare today, or have we just kind of gone into such a different era technologically that it's impossible to apply this analysis to warfare today? I don't know. That's a good question. But the point is that it's an analysis which is absolutely I just like it's like reading this is as equally peculiar as reading something that was written like 3,000 years ago or maybe 2,500 years ago, whenever people started writing first, right? Like it's equally as jarring to today's way of thinking as anything I've ever read. So let's get into the analysis. All right. So we have his okay. So Clausewitz is basically Platonic here. If you're a good reader of Plato, which there are very few of, you'll know that Plato does incorporate into his philosophy a kind of paradigm of human. Um, Plato doesn't say genius, but a paradigm of human sort of. Because I don't like the word excellence. That's too like kind of neoliberal or something. I would say nobility. Plato has a kind of paradigm of human nobility, by which the philosopher ruler is trying to establish himself through, and that is the fusion of you might call in Plato's terms in his dialogues he calls something like warlike courage with philosophic temperament. So you're talking about something intellectual and something energetic, and you have the same basic harmonic paradigm here in Clausewitz. So he says, just to read from the kind of very beginning, pretty much of this section, he says, any complex activity, if it is to be carried on with any degree of virtue, calls for appropriate gifts of intellect and temperament. If they are outstanding and reveal themselves in exceptional achievements, their possessor is called a so-called genius. So the definition of genius for Clausewitz is the kind of fusion between temperament and intellect. So kind of intellectual capacities, mental capacities, rational capacities, what we would call in modern terms intelligence and temperament. Now, temperament, what does that mean anymore? I don't know. Like, I think in Clausewitz's day, temperament was more holistic. It kind of meant your physiological and your sort of particular personality traits. I feel like today temperament is a kind of outdated word almost. We don't use this word anymore. We tend to kind of speak in terms of personality, or we speak in terms of like your temperament is determined by things like instinct or drives or biology of some kind. Temperament, I think, includes both of those two things. So basically, you're talking about something psychological, something embodied, something energetic and emotional, and you're talking about obviously like the rational intellect. Yeah, just to push the point further, he says we have said in combination, since it is precisely the essence of military genius, that it does not consist in a single appropriate gift, courage, for example, while other qualities of mind or temperament are wanting or are not suited to war. Genius consists in a harmonious combination of elements, in which one or the other ability may predominate, but none may be in conflict with the rest. So you could still have a predominant disposition, but there's some sort of harmony, and it's not in conflict with each other. So this is interesting because it also brings up kind of historical and anthropological points, which we'll get into now. So I'll keep reading. If every soldier needed some degree of military genius, our armies would be very weak, for the term refers to a special cast of mental or moral powers, which can rarely occur in an army when society has to employ its abilities in many different areas. The smaller the range of activities of a nation and the more the military factor dominates, the greater will be the incidence of military genius. This, however, is true only of its distribution, not of its quality. The latter depends, so the quality depends on the general intellectual development of a given society. In any primitive warlike race, the warrior spirit is far more common than among civilized peoples. It is possessed by almost every warrior, but in civilized societies, only necessity will stimulate it in the people as a whole, since they lack the natural disposition for it. On the other hand, we will never find a savage who is truly a great military commander, and very rarely one who will be considered a military genius, since this requires a degree of intellectual powers beyond anything that primitive people can develop. Okay, so that's an interesting point about the distinction between like primitive societies and what do you call civilized societies? I mean, this is a translation, of course, right? But what we would probably call today developed societies. So the primitive societies basically have more common warlike people, and developed societies, civilized societies, have more. It's more common to have like rational, intellectual people, right? So both of those societies are deprived in some sense of something. But it's actually only the more developed societies that can have military geniuses, because you need a harmony of the two. And in developed societies, civilized societies, you're still going to have warlike people, or you're still going to have some, and you're still going to have people that are warlike if they have to be. They may not be on a day-to-day basis, but if the situation calls for it, they have to be. Now, yeah, this is written in sometime, I think, in the 1830s. Correct me if I'm wrong, but so does that statement still hold true? Like, does necessity make us warlike anymore, or can we just rely on nuclear deterrence and drones and a kind of a small professionalized sort of technologically advanced army, and not have to actually, like, the society in a time of turmoil today doesn't necessarily get plunged into a warlike character out of necessity. that hasn't been the case since the end of World War II. Now maybe that could be in the case again in the future, who knows? But it hasn't been the case since the end of World War II. So I would say that perhaps that observation is a little bit more contingent to his historical era than kind of something which reflects an eternal disposition. But nonetheless, basically, yeah, you have the observation that only civilized or developed societies can have military genius, because civilized societies still can have warlike spirit, but um, primitive societies, as warlike as they are, never really have the intellectual and rational genius. I do think like Genghis Khan was the one example that I think contradicted that a little bit. I would like to hear what Clausewitz thinks of Genghis Khan, because it seems to me like they like would you call Mongolia of the time like a civilized or advanced society? But then again, it's like I think it's kind of clear that clearly Genghis Khan and his generals had some sort of military genius, or else they wouldn't have gotten as far as they did. What about the people who came down from the steppes? These Indo-European conquerors who came down from the steppes all those thousands and thousands of years ago, just expanded out all that everywhere they went. This small group of people just expanded like all the way to the furthest branches of Western Europe and into Iran and into Turkey, all these places. Like how did were they civilized? And I don't know. Like I think there's room to question this. I think there's room to question the idea that primitive societies can't express military genius. I think there's room to question it. There's also room to question whether advanced societies, civilized societies, can be warlike if there's a necessity. That's also, I think, there's a question mark over that, somewhat because of technology, right? But there's a question mark over that too. But anyway, it's an interesting observation, and I think it does roughly make some sense. Although I would put a few caveats in. The other thing I think maybe to note on that section is the observation that when a society it draws its activity towards its energy and activity towards many different pursuits, that a society that focuses that energy on war will obviously end up producing more military geniuses. And this is important because Clausewitz was Prussian, and for people who don't know about Prussia, it was often seen as by the kind of so-called more developed states of Western Europe. It was seen as this backward kind of agrarian, warlike, aristocratic state, something that was closer to antiquity than the 19th century. And that's important because it's often criticized for those reasons. There's a book I'm reading at the moment about the history of Prussia and its military, and the writer is extremely, obviously, very kind of, I think, biased against this particular sort of society. And there's a lot of tensions which he discusses between, for example, integrating the bourgeoisie into the military, because you have a kind of older kind of military aristocracy who was a bit less inclusive. Perhaps I'm not saying the Prussian ruling class was completely correct in every decision they made. But there's a lot of tensions over that. But you do see here that like for example, a kind of mercantile society, consumer society, a mercantile society, or whatever you want to call it, like will draw its energy and initiative into making money, basically, in trade. And the more that happens, the less military geniuses you're going to have. I mean, like there hasn't been a military genius since like an active one. Like no one looks at World War I and goes, "Oh yes, General so and so. Did you see what he pulled off at this or that?" Like we understand World War I as just like a series of stupid blunders by really incompetent generals who didn't know what the fuck they were doing, And that's partly because the technology was changing a lot too. So they were walking into kind of new technological terrain in that war. And it was also partially because there was a really high disregard for the lives of the soldiers in the trenches, I think too. But like we don't look back at World War One or World War Two and think, oh, this military genius here or there. But it was quite common to think that way in the early 19th century, in the 18th century, and so forth. It was quite common to think in this way. You had Frederick the Great, you obviously had Napoleon, and you had a number of others who were political rulers, but were also military geniuses. He doesn't really. That kind of just stopped in the late 19th century. And Prussia was somewhere that produced that sort of person, and it's heavily criticized by liberals. It's always been heavily criticized by liberals. I don't think modern liberals, contemporary liberals, even know what Prussia is or where it was. But the liberals of its time have always criticized Prussia for being a kind of proto-fascist military aristocracy, totally reactionary, holding the society back. But actually, the Prussians were the ones who unified Germany, and that's why Berlin is in. That's why the capital is Berlin. Is in Prussia. So things are a bit more complicated here, and it is basically true. Just to come back to that observation that a society that's directing all of its energy and initiative in different ways quite clearly will not produce geniuses of this sort. So maybe Prussia wasn't totally wrong to be skeptical of the inclusion of the bourgeoisie into the military like this, because perhaps they kind of understood that, well, these are kind of mercantile people, and they're going to basically draw our energy towards something else, which is exactly what happened in in over time, right? It's exactly what happened with what liberal society has gradually done. And you could say, well, that's good because it's less war. Well, not really, because you have a military-industrial complex that just produces devastating weapons. The people who invented nuclear weapons weren't warriors, they weren't soldiers, they were scientists. You know what I mean? And they were, and the people that mass produced the bombs that are dropped on Afghani weddings or something. These people, are industrialists. It's not necessary that we get more peace from having, the industrialists and the mercantilists take over the society, because actually they might just find a way of making profit in warfare, and they may reduce the virtue of warfare. They may reduce the sense of honor in warfare, which then deregulates its kind of ethical standards, which makes us encounter even bigger catastrophes and horrors than usual warfare. So the situation here is extremely complicated, and there's a lot to be said about how much a society should educate, train, and fund and provide resources for the military. Basically, there's a lot to be said there. Okay, so there's lots of interesting insights into psychology and particularly, I suppose, psychology here. Education and psychology probably are the most common themes we're going to be talking about. But he says, okay, so you got two kinds of courage according to Clausewitz. So I'm going to read out this section. There's two kinds of courage: courage in the face of personal danger, and courage to accept responsibility, either before the tribunal of some outside power or before the court of one's own conscience. Only the first kind will be discussed here. Okay, courage in the face of personal danger is also of two kinds. It may be indifferent to danger, which could be due to the individual's constitution, or to his holding life cheap, or to habit. In any case, it must be regarded as a permanent condition. Alternatively, courage may result from such positive motives as ambition, patriotism, or enthusiasm of any kind. In that case, courage is a feeling, not an emotion, not a and not a permanent state. It's weird to say an emotion is not a permanent state, but whatever. Um, these two kinds of courage act in different ways. The first is the more dependable, having become second by nature. It will never fail. The other will often achieve more. There is more reliability in the first kind, more boldness in the second kind. The first leaves the mind calmer, the second tends to stimulate, but it can also blind. The highest kind of courage is a compound of both. Okay, so again, this is interesting because it kind of fits the same dialectic we're talking about earlier of like primitive societies and civilized societies. Because I think that if you were to put the two kinds of courage um, into those camps, I think you could fit it in. Like you could say that courage, which is um, down to the individual's constitution, holding life cheap or habit, I suppose that would fit the primitive person better, right? Like out of habit, they're sort of used to hardship. Perhaps they're around, death a lot, and it's life is cheaper to them. You could say. I mean, maybe this isn't true, but I mean, it's kind of a. This is, I think, roughly speaking, if you're courageous out of kind of just habit, perhaps you don't consider your own life particularly valuable, and maybe you're sort of used to pain as well. You're sort of used to hardship and pain. Your constitution is strong in that regard. You're probably in the first camp. And the second camp might fit the civilized person more, right? Because they have positive motivations. It's not really habit or constitution necessarily, but it's positive motivations, ambition, patriotism. We could also see a kind of idealism, right? And we know that this tends to emerge more in more sort of so-called civilized societies, right? They become more idealistic in some sense. That they develop kind of stronger attachments to ideas and ideals and concepts, and perhaps they're a social group is of a kind of more conceptual or larger or more ethical kind. Like if you're a primitive, you probably just have like your local your tribe. It's it's very intimate and direct. But if you're living in like a modern nation state and you've got ideals about let's say the like you're in the Napoleonic Legion, and you have ideals about not only France but also things like equality and freedom and stuff. Like there's an idealism there which gives people a kind of positive motivation for being courageous. All right. Maybe they're not living day to day in a kind of habitual state of courage, but they're able to be sort of motivated into a more on occasion a more idealistic state of courage. So that's something. That's a distinction which I think is important. So he says the first is the more dependable, having become second nature. It's more habit, right? The other will often achieve more, though. There's more reliability in the first because it's more consistent, and there's more boldness in the second. It's more like it sees something greater. It's more ambitious. It's more bold. It's more daring. Um, Alcibiades from ancient Greece is probably a good example here, right? Like he was from the upper class. He probably lived a pampered life by if by the standards of the time and of in comparison to the kind of so-called ordinary people of the time. But but he's got this like kind of daring, and that daring is it gives him the capacity to endure a lot of hardship and pain and sacrifice and suffering and so on. So obviously he says here again that the highest courage is a compound of the two. So it's something that is kind of disposition and second nature and habitual, but it's also motivated by higher ideals, positive motivations. Okay, I keep reading. He says, War is the realm of physical exertion and suffering. These will destroy us unless we can make ourselves indifferent to them. And for this birth, birth or training must provide us with a certain strength of body and soul. If we do possess these qualities, then even if we have nothing but common sense to guide them, we should be well equipped for war. It's exactly these qualities that primitive and semi-civilized people usually possess. Okay, and then he continues: if we pursue the demands that war makes on those who practice it, we come to the region dominated by the powers of intellect. War is the realm of uncertainty. Three-quarters of the factors of which action in war is based are wrapped in the fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. A sensitive and discriminating judgment is called for, a skilled intelligence to scent out the truth. Average intelligence may recognize the truth occasionally, and exceptional courage may now and then retrieve a blunder. But usually intellectual inadequacy will be shown up by indifferent achievement. War is the realm of chance. No other human activity gives it greater scope. No other has such incessant and varied dealings with this intruder. Okay, so so like, obviously the disposition of being, what we might call modern terms tough, is extremely important. Um, but because war is such a realm of chance, the powers of the intellect end up being extremely helpful and necessary here. Um, so again, a kind of harmony of both obviously is ideal. We immediately see how, on one hand, yes, like a capacity to endure pain and courage and all sorts is very much necessary, but at the same time, there's a kind of perceptive intelligence which is going on here too. Now, on one hand, you could reduce this perceptive intelligence, as we would probably do today, to calculation. Can you calculate the outcomes of situations? If you do this or do that, what could be the consequences? And can you kind of evaluate all that? And like a computer can do these things, right? But I think Clausewitz is not just talking about like cause and effect. There's something here that's beyond mere cause and effect, which again would be the way that a contemporary military tactician would think of things in cause and effect. He's not talking about cause and effect. We just mentioned earlier he's talking about things like patriotism. There's a kind of boldness, right? You don't need to be bold to calculate cause and effect of situations and events and outcomes and actions. You don't need to be bold. You don't need to have a higher ideals like patriotism. Um, Boldness here and this sort of power of the intellect, there's already a kind of element in there which is beyond calculation. He's not talking about mere calculation. He's not even talking about, I don't think, fusing mere calculation with hardening your kind of psychological and physical disposition to be ready for hardship. It's more than that. There's something else going on here. There's a deeper thing that he's talking about here, as we're going to be exploring throughout this entire reading. A kind of perceptive faculty that could be considered daring. Like thinking of doing something in a situation that no one could even imagine doing, seeing something no one else can see. There's a kind of intuitive intelligence here, which I think Clausewitz is really leaning into here. Of course, planning, rational calculation is part of it, obviously, because that's a part of everything. But it's there. But when we say the power of the intellect here, don't think of reducing it to cause and effect and rational calculation. I do think that there's a kind of genius which is I'll put it this way, a kind of perceptive faculty to see something which involves, in some sense, imagination as well. Imagination is part of it. Okay, so now we can talk more about the kind of perceptive faculty that we were discussing earlier, the imagination, um, and the what you might call the intuitive intelligence. Um, I suppose this is kind of related to what Aristotle called phronesis, like practical intelligence. Although it's practical intelligence under very specific circumstances, which I will try to elucidate here. Um, so, just to continue reading a quote, he says, "If the mind is to emerge unscathed from this relentless struggle with the unforeseen," so I'll stop for a second. Dealing with warfare, you're dealing with the unforeseen. You're dealing with lots of chance. You're dealing with lots of different possibilities. You're dealing with a kind of blurry space. You're dealing with a blurry space. You can't see what's going to happen. You can't plan everything completely. There's a lot of chance, contingency, risk in this domain. To put it in simple terms, if the mind is to emerge unscathed from this relentless struggle with the unforeseen, two qualities are indispensable. First, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead. The first of these qualities is described by the French term, French is not good, coup d'oeil. Coup d'oeil. That is a French term, and you can do a little bit of a research on this online. It means to understand something at a glance. Stroke of the eye, I think, is the literal meaning of this word. Stroke of the eye. So, I thought of what would be a good kind of maybe like a cinematic or image to describe this, and actually, it's okay. It's not really completely relevant because it's not in a position of generalship commanding over an army. It's more individualized, but it is somewhat of a good example, like Jason Bourne. Think of the film Jason Bourne, the way he can like walk into a room and like figure out like where everything is that he needs to know in order to like escape or something. He can kind of absorb all this information intuitively very quickly and make sort of split decisions, um, and act on those decisions very effectively. Like he'll go and he'll be like walking down. He'll be, like some police will be chasing him, and he'll be stuck in a small space with these police, and he'll like figure out some ludicrous way of escaping, and he'll do it like instantaneously. He'll like analyze the whole situation, where the weapons are, where the window or escape routes are. He'll take one of the. There's like a scene in one of the Jason Bourne films where he like takes a knocks out a police officer, but then he takes some sort of phone or walkie-talkie, and then he sort of like hacks the walkie-talkie so that he can call someone from a certain specific uh, place, pretending he is someone else that he's not. It's just like he just thinks of everything. He just thinks of everything like instantaneously. I suppose that's kind of individualized, um, um, uh, representation. It's kind of thinking on your feet would be a more colloquial term we use in English. Thinking on your feet. But it's got this connotation to it where it's like, obviously abstracting from the individual situation onto the battlefield, to be able to sort of analyze the situation kind of continuously and see uh, see the situation, make split decisions, to harness your intuition in this way. And this is, somewhat a temperamental thing, and it's somewhat of an intellectual thing. It takes, like to train this capacity. I would say to train this aspect of Aristotelian phronesis, you need to be able to probably have some level of experience and practice thinking in this way and making decisions in this way. I would say you need a certain amount of aggression because you have to kind of lock into a possibility, and you have to kind of stick to that and assert it. If you're overly cautious and risk averse, your intuition will be smothered, right? You're not going to like act on it. You're going to be second guessing yourself, third guessing, fourth guessing yourself the whole time. Which is fine in a lot of situations, but in situations such as war, um, or a situation that someone like Jason Bourne is caught into the whole time, where he has to make very very quick decisions in high stakes, high risk, kind of intensive environments. It's somewhat something you could probably gain from experience, but it is also somewhat something that comes from intelligence and temperament as well. Like to simply just analyze a situation and then act is requires intelligence to analyze, to observe, to sort of take in all the information and make it coherent. But it also requires a certain temperament, because you have to act on that analysis. If you're too calculated, if you're too risk averse, if you're too cautious, you won't be able to act. So again, there's this kind of synthesis between the temperament and the intellect, between the theory and the action. There's a constant synthesis going on here through all these different sections. And secondarily, I think what's interesting here is also the speed by which this happens. Like, an academic or a scientific researcher or a kind of technocratic politician will be able to like slowly take in all this information that he finds in some research or whatever, or plan something over a very long time, and sort of weigh up the pros and cons and do all this calculation, and calculate, but over like an academic or a researcher or a kind of technocratic politician will constantly be making decisions based on information and analyzing information, but they'll do it in a safe environment where there's a lot of time and the risks are perhaps less intense, right? I think this is one of the reasons COVID was such a disaster. It's because the situation forced a bunch of politicians that were used to having like years and years and years of um, like space, and like they weren't used to making very risky decisions. You have to make a decision about this law or that law, or developing something here, doing something there. You can take years to decide, kind of slow bureaucratic processes. You can get lots of advice from experts and advisors, and you can weigh up the pros and cons, blah blah blah. But suddenly when you're thrown into a kind of high risk, dangerous, intense situation where you don't have the time and space to be so cautious in your thinking, you have to sort of make decisions quickly, because if you don't make decisions quickly, the consequences are bad. Suddenly you see how sort of stupid they all become, right? So there's a kind of temporal playing field, we could say, that's going on here. The academic, the researcher, the kind of technocratic politician, they make decisions, and sometimes they make good decisions, and sometimes they analyze things well because they can be intelligent people, but they make these decisions within a low stakes, low risk, temporally comfortable environment. The military general, particularly in the epoch that we're speaking of, makes these decisions in very very high stakes, risky, dangerous, and temporally intense environments. So it's a kind of talent. It's a kind of military genius. It's a part of a military virtue. It's part of that phronesis that Aristotle talked about. That we can make intelligent decisions and calculations within a high stakes, temporally difficult environment. Where of course there's a lot of emotional turmoil, fear, danger, blah blah blah. And I think this is one of the reasons we like films like Jason Bourne, because he does that basically. He does it on a kind of individualized level. He's a kind of secret agent spy. He doesn't make these decisions in like over like a military level, but he makes them on a kind of smaller scale of the same sort of situations that we're speaking of here. So yeah, that's the sort of peculiar intuitive perceptive talents, we could say, that the military genius should have. And just a little bit more, because I did a bit of research on this term, coup d'oil, that, sorry if I'm pronouncing it badly if you're a French speaker, but I, you know, people have been aware of this now in 19th, 17th, 19th and 18th century uh, military thinkers, obviously Clausewitz being one of them, but also do a little Wikipedia research on this, and you can see that there's other people who've mentioned that Frederick the Great of Prussia said the perfection of it. So this is a quote from him: "The perfection of that art to learn at one just and determined view the benefits." Sorry, what that? So this is a really weird way of putting it. Let me read that again. The perfection of that art to learn at one just and determined view the benefits and advantages of a country where posts are to be placed and how to act upon the annoyance of the enemy. This is, in a word, the true meaning of the term coup d'oil, without which any officer may commit errors of the greatest consequences. And then Napoleon, of course, remarked on it, and he said, quote, "There is a gift of being able to see at a glance the possibilities offered by the terrain. One can call it coup d'oil, and it is inborn in the greatest generals." Yeah, so you can see how this was a kind of commonly understood concept at the time. Interesting experiment to go into your local military barracks and see if anyone today knows this term. So just before I move on, segue into the preceding observations which Clausewitz has made in this section, I want to point out something because it's theoretically very relevant here. And as regular viewers of this channel will know, I've done some work on Paul Virilio, the philosopher of speed, who speaks a lot about the technological effect of speed and weapon systems and all this stuff. I've taught a course with Joshua Hansen on Virilio, and Virilio, is someone who I think is somewhat I don't want to say nostalgic. That sounds dismissive, but it's somewhat holding on to the value of certain qualities of, you could say, like the older classical military intelligence and political intelligence, of course, too. Although those two things are very intrinsic to each other, I think, in many ways. Virilio will argue that the speed of weapon systems, particularly designed after World War II, the speed of weapon systems, with nuclear warheads and with drones and with we now have hypersonic missile systems and all this stuff. The speed of those systems became so fast, and the damage of them, particularly with nukes, became so catastrophic that you started to get developing after World War II, like kind of scientifically calculated, technologically advanced military apparatuses that would calculate and analyze any threat detection for missiles. Like, during the Cold War, are the Soviets putting weapons here? Are they, we have to have a system which, like, full of satellites and all sorts of other kind of technologically advanced weapons detection systems, right? So it's detection, so it's replacing the perception of the human with the detection faculties of the machine. And in order to protect us against the threats of these long-range weapons, technologically advanced instruments were created. And so the military sort of became completely technologized, and sort of experts that were managing these systems of weapon threat detection alert systems were embraced, and the as Avrilia will point out, the old school kind of statesman and military general was largely replaced because you just can't think fast enough. If an enemy is going to fire a nuclear warhead at you, it sort of requires a technologically advanced system of detection to alert you. And therefore, because of those technologies, we could say the kind of traditional reason and faculties of virtue as well, virtue and intellectual capacities of the general and of the traditional military. Sorry, the traditional military general and the politician were sort of overtaken, automated. We could even say automated by systems, experts, weapons detection systems, all that, right? And that's, I think, really very important here because Clausewitz is, pointing to a form of intelligence, thinking on your feet, perceiving with a stroke of the eye, a kind of, as we've explained, that is no longer common today. That sort of intelligence is no longer common today. And I think of situations such as weapons of mass destruction or global pandemics where you see a ruling class, you see a kind of decision making class, technocrats, who are really stupid, despite being well educated people, like really, really stupid, like surprisingly incompetent. And I think that does offer us one explanation to why the ruling classes of the post-war technocratic, period in the 21st century have sort of proved themselves chronically, time and time again, to be really inadequate and stupid. This is still kind of unanswered. I think we all intuitively understand that they're stupid and they're incompetent, but we don't really know why. So this offers an explanation that they don't have this thinking on your feet, coup Doyle, perceptive faculty, which the military genius and the I would say also the very astute politician, political leader once had, basically. So that's one of the reasons I read these texts and I analyze them like this isn't so I can LARP and say, oh, wouldn't it be cool to think like you're Frederick the Great or Napoleon or something? No, because the history around these men, the nature of their character and their capacities and their characteristics does lead to larger conversations which are much more relevant to today than we would like to admit, especially if we want to create an elite which is actually worth anything and be led and ruled by people that actually have the capacity to do that properly. These are extremely important concepts to think about. And we see this issue that I was just describing also manifesting in crises of spatial crises and so forth. There's, another quality the military genius needs to have is a good sense of space and, well, I suppose more specifically here, terrain. I'll just read out the quote from Clausewitz first. In these ways, the relationship between warfare and terrain determines the peculiar character of military action. If we consider other activities connected with the soil, gardening, for example, farming, building, hydraulic engineering, mining, gamekeeping, forestry, none extends to more than a very limited area, and a working knowledge of that area is soon acquired. But a commander must submit his work to a partner space which he can never completely understand, and which which because of the constant movement and change to which he is subject, he can never really come to know. To be sure, the enemy is generally no better off, but the handicap, though shared, is still a handicap, and the man with enough talent and experience to overcome it will have a real advantage. So he's talking about knowing the terrain, and this is a very common thing, which you can see in history.
smaller bands of like guerrilla warfare fighters will often be able to compensate for their lack of numbers and lack of firepower because they know the terrain. Um, there's so many examples of this. Teutoburg Forest, for example. The conflicts between the British and the Irish actually during the War of Independence, another good example. The British didn't really know the terrain very well, didn't really know the area. Um, and the soldiers of independence like knew it quite well. There's so many. The Napoleonic legions going into Russia, they underestimated the winter, and so forth. I think something similar happened with the German army in World War II, underestimating the Russian winter. There's a lack of knowledge about terrain puts you at a deep handicap, and I suppose you can't really know the terrain in as intimately as a local can. I mean, it's just impossible. But I suppose you could develop understandings of terrain, or at least look out for signs of what's important and what's not important, weather patterns, topography. Um, uh, you could sort of develop, I suppose, a sense of what you should be keeping an eye on or doing research about in a certain terrain if you're a commander who's moving your army through it. And again, this is something which I think it seems like a lot of large, powerful, sort of more imperialistic militaries do fall into the trap of frequently, that they go into parts of the world in which they don't fully understand the terrain, or they don't prepare for what they should be prepared for, and it comes back to bite them. But I do think in our time with the technology and the sort of technologization of warfare with drones and so on, uh, you see this problem on steroids. Like, it's not only that a foreign military doesn't know the local terrain as well as they should. It's almost like any importance placed on terrain and locality is completely dismissed. Like you can run a military successfully from like a kind of technologically advanced office building, just giving orders to people on the ground from thousands of miles away through through modern communication technology, sending people here and there, using drone weapons and so forth. Like, this is such a neglect of locality and terrain that you do kind of have to wonder how will that play out in the long term. The Americans have really taken that problem to the next level. They've really taken it to the next level. Commanding uh, military operations in the Middle East from an office in Virginia. Uh, watching everything through a screen. I don't know if you remember the assassination, or not, the, I suppose, capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, and all these like American politicians were watching it all on a screen, and it was being live streamed through one of the soldiers' helmets. He's wearing like a GoPro or something. And it's just kind of like it's so much abstraction from the locality that you wonder how that's going to affect the military supremacy of a certain power. Historically, it's not turned out very well. Once you become abstracted from a terrain and you don't understand it properly, it does tend to turn out badly. So yeah, I mean, like, it's an interesting question to ask for the next few decades, how technologically how technologically superior militaries through a really radical abstraction from terrain and locality will actually be undermined in their capacity to dominate through that. And again, I think it does come back to this question of practical intelligence, like phronesis, because it, it's it, it's difficult to develop the kind of intelligence which is being described in this chapter from a kind of technologically abstracted or bureaucratically abstracted position. if you're not kind of in a terrain, kind of engaging with it actively, um, it's probably difficult to develop a understanding, like not a complete understanding of every single terrain you're in, but an understanding of what's important to look out for and what's important to prepare for. You know, you're never really gonna. I don't think you're ever really gonna understand that properly from like an office building somewhere, right? Because you're just not going to be in the situations where you're going to learn through trial and error and through experience. Like a good example of this is the Battle of Waterloo, when the Napoleonic army couldn't get their cannons through the through this kind of open grassy field the battle was being conducted on, because the mud was so thick, because the rain was heavy, and like they couldn't drag their cannons through that mud quick enough. So their usual firepower they had from their artillery wasn't as good on the occasion as would have been if the terrain had been dry, if it has been very dry weather and they could just carried it over easily. So like little things, little contingencies like that can just completely change everything. And I suppose if you don't know what you're looking out for to prepare for, well then you're not even going to be able to in any way perceive what could happen, right? So there's lots of and again, it's not about specific historical examples. Like the question here is universal. Like the question here is universal. It's about you know how do you how do you train uh, how do you train adequate leadership? Um, can that happen through, for example, the kind of technologically advanced bureaucratic form of managerial kind of commandship and leadership that is overtaken the entire modern world, it seems. That is a good question. And anyway, um, just to comment a little bit on some more of Clausewitz's observations. He'll talk a little bit more in this section um, about strength of character and strength of mind, and he does make some interesting observations here about the kind of difference between what he calls stolid men, and I suppose this is a little bit stoic. These are men that are they're not very expressive, they're not very passionate, um, bit kind of detached, and men which are more proud and proud and passionate and impulsive. And he makes some interesting observations here about the fact that stolid men are uh, uh, more consistent and more reliable, but they lack initiative. Whereas more, I suppose, more proud, more passionate men are, you know, have more initiative, but are somewhat less reliable, and they're also difficult over a long period of time, because one brief battle, you're probably going to prefer having a group of extremely passionate, enthusiastic men, but over a long campaign that can burn out. So there's a kind of practical and temporal aspect to this, like endurance. How does that energy sort of endure through a long campaign? And so Clausewitz will basically say that a good military leader has to take all these factors into account. Because he has to think about how do you manage these different kinds of men, and how do you manage the sort of psychopolitics and emotional matrix of these men um, throughout a long campaign. You don't want them to burn out, but you also don't want them to be completely and utterly without initiative and without passion either. So again, there's a kind of synthesizing process which is going on as usual throughout all of this section, where the temperament and the intellect are being harmonized and synthesized in some sort of qualitatively better way.